Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, storytelling madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by the combined efforts of Larry Holsworth and Karl Smallwood, so be sure to show them both some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about famous historical figures. Let's get to it. Few entertainers ever achieved greater dominance than that attained by Dean Martin in the second half of the 20th century. Martin's popularity made him a major star in the recording industry, with radio, film, television, and frequent live appearances. He developed a persona as a devil-may-care playboy with a taste for booze, broads, and getting big. We mean, this is a man who, upon his death, literally caused all of Vegas to go dark in his honor. Yet in reality, Martin was a family man who drank mostly sparingly, preferring to spend his time when not performing at home with his family. To paraphrase fellow Rat Pack member and longtime confidant and friend of Martin, Frank Sinatra, "I spill more than Dean drinks." Speaking of music, Martin's recording career saw him releasing several songs which remain indelibly linked to his image to this day, including That's Amore and his signature song Everybody Loves Somebody. His film career saw him portray a diverse number of roles. He starred as a hapless straight man to the slapstick of his longtime partner Jerry Lewis in a series of comedies beginning in the 1940s. He graduated to serious acting alongside such luminaries of Hollywood as Marlon Brando and John Wayne. He spoofed the spy thrillers birthed by James Bond films as well as his own lifestyle in the Matt Helm series in the 1960s. All were financially successful. He branched into television with his own variety series, as well as appearing as a guest on shows hosted by Jack Benny, Bob Hope, and the aforementioned Frank Sinatra, as well as many others. His onstage appearances with Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and others became legendary, especially those at the famed Sands Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Many are still popular videos on YouTube, which you're just gonna have to take our word for, because putting a clip in would absolutely get us a copyright strike. In the 1970s, Frank Sinatra and those who tooled around with him were known around Hollywood circles as the chairman of the board. This was just one of the many monikers Martin would come to be known by, the most notable being the King of Cool, but he would alternately be referred to as Make a Million Martin and to his closest friends simply Dino, which wasn't a nickname but his actual name, given to him by his immigrant parents at birth. Dino's story is a classic rags to riches tale of rising from hard times to the top of the world. It wasn't always easy nor always smooth, but somehow Dean always made it look effortless, always as if he was playing a great joke upon the world. Here is part of his story. Dino Paul Crocetti was born in the hardscrabble Ohio town of Steubenville on June 17, 1917, into a home of modest means. The language of the Crocetti household was Italian, with Dean only learning English when he started school, something that made him the target of bullies who Dean learned to deal with by punching them as hard as he could in the face, something that resulted in him briefly considering a career as a boxer. A dream that died when Dean, in his own words, won all but 11 of the 12 fights he took part in. The veracity of this claim is unclear, as many of the bouts Martin likely took part in weren't exactly prize fights and were probably more like fist fights in abandoned factories where the winner would be the person still able to stand after the fight was over. Hell, on one occasion, Martin is known to have sold tickets for people to watch him and his roommate Sonny King punch the crap out of each other until one of them fell over in their apartment to earn a quick buck, which is really funny. That said, while the extent of Martin's boxing career and prowess with a fist is difficult to ascertain, it was pretty obvious that he had at some point been in a pretty gnarly fight, with Martin clearly sporting several injuries common among boxers, such as scarring about the eyes and an improperly set broken nose. An injury he'd later correct with plastic surgery, though the results were questionable, with many still commenting on his misaligned schnoz. Martin even had his own ring name, Kid Crochet. Ever the comedian, when asked about why he picked such a unassuming ring name, he'd usually quip, "Kid Needlepoint was taken." Anyway, by the time Dino was a sophomore at Steubenville High School, he was of the opinion that he knew as much about the subjects being taught as did the teachers supposedly educating him. A most bold claim, given that another boast of Martin's is that he'd only ever read one book in his entire life, Black Beauty. Although by no means an avid reader by his own admission, Martin did reportedly have a fondness for comic books. Though, to save his image as a cool playboy, would have his friends buy them for him when he became a millionaire celebrity. Whatever the case, Martin dropped out of high school in 10th grade. He had then been working as a stock boy in a cigar store since the age of 12. The cigar store served as a front for an illegal casino and speakeasy, and the youngster saw earning opportunities beyond those offered in the legal part of the store. Steubenville was a steel town, with a port on the Ohio River, and the customers Dino served in the speakeasy were steelworkers, bargemen, and other blue-collar workers. Hard-working, hard-gambling, and hard-drinking men. In addition to working as a croupier, Dino dealt blackjack, served liquor, collected gambling losses, and occasionally entertained the customers by singing. His singing led to other opportunities with local groups, and the former Kid Crochet began calling himself Dino Martin when he sang with local orchestras. He adopted a crooning style of singing, and by 1940 he began appearing with a Cleveland orchestra led by bandleader Sammy Watkins. He was drafted during World War II, but was deemed medically unfit due to a previously undiagnosed hernia. By 1943, having by then adopted the name of Dean Martin, he was appearing with different orchestras in New York nightclubs, having left the somewhat seedier atmosphere of Steubenville behind him. He maintained his home in Cleveland, having married his first wife there in late 1941. Eventually, the couple had 4 children together before divorcing in 1949. By then, the entertainment career of Dean Martin was well underway. In 1944, Dean Martin was appearing in the Glass Hat Club in New York's Belmont Plaza Hotel. Another act on the same bill in the locally famous club was a comedian going by the name of Jerry Lewis. The two became close friends and often introduced each other to the audience during their respective performances. On July 24, 1946, the two appeared together as an act at the 500 Club in Atlantic City, New Jersey. According to legend, the two were warned after their first performance together that if the act did not improve significantly and very quickly, they would both be asked to pursue other lines of work. According to Lewis, they agreed that Martin would appear as a straight singing act when Lewis, costumed as a busboy, would interrupt him with heckling, slapstick humor, and other material from his comedy act. Martin would basically respond by chucking loaves of bread at Lewis, and the pair would essentially improvise the rest of the set, borrowing half-remembered jokes from old vaudeville acts, and generally just having fun, playing off one another's energy. The performance was a hit and led to bookings up and down the East Coast, eventually to a hit run at New York's famed Copacabana. You know, like from that song. That booking led in turn to an appearance on the new medium of television on a program called Toast of the Town, hosted by, at the time, a little-known New York celebrity and newspaper columnist Ed Sullivan. The show would, of course, eventually become one of the most well-known and celebrated in the history of the medium and be named directly after its host, but at the time it was just another stopgap on the pair's journey to the top. Around 1948, Martin and Lewis hired outside writers to help develop new material. Leading up to this point, they had scripted the show entirely by themselves. Among the writers, they hired Norman Lear, who would eventually create iconic television productions including All of the Family, The Jeffersons, One Day at a Time, and Good Times, among many others. Martin and Lewis branched into radio in 1949 and film later that same year. Their first appearance on film was in My Friend Irma. As the decade of the 1950s began, Martin and Lewis appeared on radio, television, motion pictures, and in live appearances in clubs and concert halls. They were the highest paid act in the United States during the early 1950s, but dissension had begun. The series of films, a total of 17 made between 1949 and 1956, irritated Martin due to their similarity to each other. To appease Dino, the act known as Martin and Lewis changed its name to Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, giving the performers greater recognition as individuals. Yet, it was not enough for Martin, who was reportedly growing tired of Lewis's massive swollen ego, which admittedly was somewhat earned. For example, according to a later interview with Martin, Lewis read a book about Charlie Chaplin, which noted how Chaplin had basically wrote and directed all of his own material, prompting Lewis to quip to Martin, "I'm exactly like Chaplin." From that point onwards, according to Martin, no one could Lewis anything, and behind-the-scenes meetings became unbearable to the point Martin just up and left, infamously telling his partner of a decade, "You're nothing but a f***ing dollar sign." After this, the two men did not speak to each other for another 20 years. Though they did eventually reconcile, their solo careers were extremely popular. So let's get back to that, shall we? Fortunately, by the time of his split from Lewis, Martin's recording career was already well underway, with several hits having appeared on the charts, but he wanted to be considered a serious actor in films. The repetitive scripts and sight gags which featured in the Martin and Lewis films had become distasteful to him. He saw himself as an actor with dramatic abilities, much more talented than a mere straight man to Jerry's antics and pratfalls. Changes in popular music not to his taste also loomed. He started lobbying for serious film roles. He also wanted to curtail traveling and staying in hotels. Throughout his life, Martin held a distaste for tall buildings, elevators, and rooms above the third floor in any building, since he also did not like climbing stairwells. These and other reasons, such as crowded streets, made him dislike New York and other eastern cities. He preferred the West Coast and its beautiful San Fernando Valley, and the Los Angeles area, since at the time the city was largely barren of skyscrapers. In 1957, although his name was well known as a star in motion pictures, Dean Martin's ability as a serious actor was questioned among film critics. His first film, without his former partner Jerry Lewis, did little to improve his reputation. The film, 10,000 Bedrooms, was panned by critics and flopped at the box office, losing over $1 million in 1950s money, which would be the equivalent of about $11 million today. In 1958, he was cast in The Young Lions for mere pennies on the dollar compared to the fees he had commanded as part of Lewis and Martin. The film saw him sharing star billing with Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift, two of the leading male actors of the day. Both Brando and Clift found themselves the target of critical displeasure for their performances, while Martin drew praise. That same year, he performed in the film Some Came Running alongside Shirley MacLaine and Frank Sinatra. Again, Martin's performance drew critical praise, with Variety magazine commenting that Martin portrayed a man dying of a terminal disease with grace and humor, whatever the hell that means. The following year, Martin cemented his place as a serious actor when he portrayed a character known only as Dude in the Howard Hawks western Rio Bravo. Martin starred as an alcoholic ne'er-do-well alongside John Wayne. Once again, the critics singled out Martin's performance as superior to the more established stars with whom he shared the billing. From that point, his film career blossomed. At the same time, he became better known to audiences through television appearances and his records. By 1960, he was seen as a recording star, a television celebrity, and a serious film actor, a bona fide triple threat. He began a series of performances on film with Frank Sinatra during the 1960s, including the original Ocean's 11 and several additional films with Shirley MacLaine. In 1964, Dean spoofed his own image of a womanizing playboy in the film Kiss Me Stupid alongside Kim Novak. No relation to Office star and writer B.J. Novak, we think. Poking fun at himself became a major part of his persona, both on and off screen during the 1960s, including in the popular Matt Helm series of films, which also spoofed the spy films of the day. Dean Martin co-produced the Matt Helm series of films, which consisted of 4 pictures beginning in 1965. Though the character was created in a series of spy novels by writer Donald Hamilton, the Matt Helm portrayed by Martin bore little resemblance to the character from the books. Martin depicted Helm as a reflection of his own carefully crafted public persona, a smooth, happy-go-lucky, hard-drinking, womanizing, devil-may-care playboy. Whilst in the books, Helm is an altogether more serious character, akin to Jason Bourne, or at least we gather that's the case given that the handful of directors who've tried to revive the series have directly evoked that series of movies when discussing it. Martin carried off the Matt Helm films with an appearance of seemingly effortless performances. At the same time he was making the films and enough money to fill Scrooge McDuck's vault from them, he was expanding his appearances on television and in the recording studio. His self-parody became a dominant feature of his live appearances, as well as in his films. The habit of mocking himself proved highly popular with audiences and fans, and Dean Martin found himself continually referred to as the King of Cool, a moniker that he did nothing to discourage. Martin's last appearance in film was in 1984, when he joined Sammy Davis Jr. as entrants in an unsanctioned cross-country car race, disguised as priests. Archival footage of him has appeared in films since, including in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and likely will continue to surface from time to time as filmmakers want to convey images of what was considered cool in the recent past. As a singer, Dean Martin developed his style as a crooner from the school of Harry Mills, of the Mills Brothers, Perry Como, or Bing Crosby. He never learned to read music, yet he worked hard at his singing, polishing his style, and as he did in acting, developed the appearance of nearly effortless performance. In 1964, Dean Martin recorded what was to become his signature song, Everybody Loves Somebody. At that stage of his career, his recordings continued to sell, but failed to reach the top 40 on the charts. Everybody Loves Somebody soared to the top of the charts in the United States, reaching #1 on Billboard. In doing so, it displaced A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. It remained at #1 for 8 weeks. For Martin, the song's success was doubly sweet, as he had little use for rock and roll music, nor the stars performing it. In June 1964, Dean Martin guest hosted the ABC television variety program The Hollywood Palace. The occasion was the first U.S. television appearance by the Rolling Stones. Martin expressed contempt for the band and its members' personal appearances, both before and following their performance. At one point, he told the audience, "You're under the impression they have long hair. Not true at all. They just have really low foreheads and high eyebrows." As was his usual practice, Dean hosted the program while acting as if he was drinking heavily. The comments, coupled with Dean's performance, led to an undying legend that Martin introduced the Stones while drunk. Other comments included his claiming that the Stones were leaving for London immediately after the show, allegedly to challenge the Beatles to a hair-pulling contest. Martin's disdain for the Rolling Stones and their music was part of his contempt for the changes in the music business that rock and roll helped bring about. Dean Martin first came to television in an era during which variety programs, often named for their sponsors, were popular. His earliest appearances were those of Martin and Lewis in the early days of the medium. As a solo artist, he appeared on programs hosted by the likes of Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, and Jack Benny. He hosted several variety shows as a guest host, including the aforementioned Hollywood Bowl, and others that aired on Ford Startime in the late 1950s. In 1965, he launched his own variety show on NBC, The Dean Martin Show. It used Everybody Loves Somebody as its theme music, with Dean hosting music and comedy acts, appearing in skits, and often singing duets with musical guests. Eventually, it ran for 264 shows until it was retooled and renamed in 1974. He continued to appear as a guest on other programs, including specials featuring performers such as Frank Sinatra. Martin appeared in Christmas specials including his own, as well as those of other leading entertainers of the period, and was a regular guest on talk shows such as The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. During all of his television appearances, Martin revealed an aversion to rehearsing, preferring instead to elicit spontaneous reactions from both himself and the audience. On his own program, Martin featured a weekly event in which he would open a door beside the stage, allowing the entrance of an unannounced special guest. According to the show's insiders, Martin usually did not know in advance who the mystery guest for the week would be. Another segment that took place nearly every week had Martin, while singing one of his songs, inserting nonsense lyrics in an attempt to make his accompanying pianist break down laughing. Martin would often leap onto the piano as part of the performance, striking a provocative pose as he crooned to his pianist. Martin wanted to avoid doing the program when it was pitched to him by NBC executives in 1964. He preferred doing live stage performances or doing films. Accordingly, he made a list of difficult demands as his price for agreeing to the show, including working only on Sunday when the show would be recorded for broadcast. He also demanded what one author described as an outrageous amount of money. To his surprise, NBC capitulated to these and many other demands, which demonstrated the star power he wielded in the 1960s. On the show itself, Martin continued to demonstrate his persona as a slightly befuddled, slightly drunk, irreverent playboy with a decided opposition to work. His lines were read off of cue cards, and if he made a mistake there were no second takes. Both his mistake and recovery appeared on the air, and he often played the error as being the result of too much sampling from the old-fashioned glass, which was constantly in his hand. While it's long been rumored that Martin was actually drinking and drinking heavily during these recordings, friends, family, and those who worked on the show have confirmed that Martin's glass seldom contained anything more than apple juice. In fact, according to his own daughter, her father would be home for dinner every night after a recording and would limit himself to a single drink, a cocktail drink at his home bar alongside his wife as a digestive before turning in for the night. Anyway, in its final season, the program was renamed the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast. These revived the ratings for Martin's show, as who wouldn't want to see a bunch of celebrities get blind pissed drunk and insult one another live on air? For another decade after this, the roasts were eventually moved to the MGM Grand Hotel in the autumn of 1974, continuing to be broadcast on NBC as a special rather than a weekly series. The show came to an end in 1984 after Martin declined the opportunity to renew his contract with the network. During its run, notable roastees included Ronald Reagan before he was president, Mr. T, Betty White, Muhammad Ali, and George Washington. Yes, that George Washington portrayed by an actor as a nod to the, at the time, upcoming United States bicentennial. Martin himself would be roasted on the show, with friend and two-time roastee Don Rickles taking on the hosting duties. Notable speakers at Martin's own roast included Orson Welles, who joked after roasting the host, "I turn my remarks to Dean Martin, who is being honored here tonight for reasons that completely elude me." Welles then proceeded to do a dramatic reading of That's Amore, quipping that the song should be transcribed for all time upon a cocktail napkin. After the end of his commitments to his own programs, Martin remained a popular guest on other programs, specials, and talk shows, demonstrating his mastery of the medium of television had not weakened over time. The original Rat Pack was an informally organized group of friends which included Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, David Niven, and Frank Sinatra. Their name is said to have come from a comment by Bacall when she viewed some of the male members returning from a night on the town, commenting that the men looked like, well, a rat pack, though the veracity of this is hard to confirm. The more famous version of the group, which included Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Joey Bishop, Peter Lawford, Sammy Davis Jr., and several peripheral members, called themselves the Summit. It was the media which tagged them as the Rat Pack. Their most enduring popular image is of the members sharing a Las Vegas stage, tuxedo-clad, drinks in hand, cutting up, clowning, interrupting each other's performances, and in general being outrageous and unrehearsed. Their most famous period began when the performers were in Las Vegas filming the original Ocean's 11, filming during the day and appearing on the stage at night. It was during this period that Martin scoffed at acting being called hard work, claiming it was nothing compared to standing all day dealing blackjack or acting as a croupier. The Rat Pack cronies appeared in several films together, as well as live in Las Vegas, though all members being together at the same time was relatively rare. Usually Dean, Frank, and Sammy were sufficient to call a gathering of the Rat Pack. Lawford fell out with Sinatra in the early 1960s after Lawford's brother-in-law, President John F. Kennedy, declined to stay at Sinatra's California compound, accepting instead the hospitality of Bing Crosby. How scandalous. Dean Martin used the Rat Pack to further his image as the inveterate playboy with a taste for the sauce, but the late-night or all-night convivial sessions of the group were more imaginary than real. Dean was usually the first to call it a night, both on the road and while at home, with Martin once famously calling the police on his own wife when a party she was throwing kept him from going to sleep. Martin called the police anonymously, pretending to be a disgruntled neighbor for anyone curious about the logistics of how all that works. Despite this, Martin was keenly aware how useful the reputation of a drunken booze hound was in keeping people out of his private affairs, and made no efforts to challenge the view people had of him. In fact, he opted instead to double down, going as far as to have a personalized license plate which read Drunkie, made for one of his many cars. All this while his glass on stage usually contained, as mentioned, nothing but apple juice. Just another stage prop. His humor was fueled by his own quick wits rather than by alcohol, but it's not like the public had to know that. Martin's friends were only too happy to play up the image he cultivated of himself, with Sinatra once telling an interviewer looking for the latest gossip about the group, "If there's ever an Olympic drinking team, Dean's gonna be the coach." Despite knowing full well that at every party they'd ever attended, Martin was always a Larry letdown and left first. Over the course of his life, Dean Martin was married 3 times. His first marriage produced 4 children before ending in divorce. His second marriage to Jean Beager produced 3 more children before it too ended in divorce in 1973, after 24 years of marriage. He married a 3rd time in 1973, though that marriage ended in divorce as well in 1976. Eventually, Martin and his second wife reconciled, though they never remarried. Martin presented a public image nearly opposite to his private life. He preferred to be at home with family over enjoying the partying style of his public image. He was an avid golfer and frequent participant in golf charity events. According to his friends, half the reason Martin was always so keen to call it a night whilst out gallivanting was to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed for a round of golf in the morning. He was also a horseman of note, breeding Andalusian horses at his California ranch, where he also took refuge from prying eyes. His son, Dean Paul Martin, from his second marriage, briefly formed a pop group with Desi Arnaz Jr. and Billy Hinch in the mid-1960s and appeared in several films and on television. Dean Paul also served in the California Air National Guard, reaching the rank of captain before being killed in a crash during a training mission. Following Dean Paul's 1987 death, Dean Martin became reclusive. His long friendship with Frank Sinatra became strained after Martin withdrew from the Together Again tour in 1988. The tour, touted by Sinatra, had been billed as the ultimate event, but Martin's heart was not in it. While Martin's relationship with Sinatra soured, it was during this time he reconnected with Jerry Lewis, with the pair's first meeting in 20 years ironically being arranged by Sinatra himself for a telethon the pair were both working on in the 1970s. This said, Lewis was still wary of upsetting his friend, notably attending Martin's son's funeral in secret, so as not to overshadow the solemnity of the occasion. After the reconciliation in the 70s, the pair would reportedly speak to one another almost every day. But they seldom made public appearances together, likely due to Martin's ailing health and aversion to the spotlight. Speaking of which, in late 1993, Dean Martin was diagnosed with lung cancer. Rather than accept surgery to remove part of the affected tissue, Martin retired from public life. He remained mostly reclusive at his home in Beverly Hills until it was announced he died on Christmas Day, 1995. In Las Vegas, the lights of the Strip were temporarily dimmed in his honor. He was interred in Los Angeles beneath the epitaph, "Everybody loves somebody sometime." Numerous communities have named streets and parks in his honor, including in his hometown of Steubenville. In Italy, the town of Montesilvano, where Dean Martin's father was born, named a public square in honor of the son of immigrants. His films remain popular and his records still sell, including his many Christmas recordings. He remains, in the eyes of many of his fans, the undisputed king of cool. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment your favorite classic comedy duo, subscribe, and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time.